Good morning to everyone. I am honored to be here with all of you today. Thanks a lot to Salto and to the team for inviting me to join this event. And I'm happy to see some people that I have seen many times until now, some in person, some, as Kostas was saying, only online, unfortunately, during this time, but hopefully we'll have more chances to meet and hang out. So today, as Marinella introduced my part, I'll try to give a short overview of the state of youth work and youth work development in the region. There is a lot to be said about this topic, especially that we're covering 5-6 countries and different levels kind of what youth work and youth work development is about. And Kostas mentioned actually 3 of these levels. He talked about this. One aspect is the tools and the activities, what is being done. Then it's also about infrastructure, and it's also about recognition. And it's a lot in there. If you unpack it, there are so many different elements. Today, I'll focus more on the recognition part and more on the infrastructure, a bit less on actual practices and actual projects, because I also think that many of you know a lot about the practice in the region, about what is going on. And maybe what is less known is how the development of youth work goes on this level of like political, legal recognition, social recognition, establishing standards, establishing quality criteria, implementing them, etc. So this is what we will talk about mostly today, and then I'll also try to give an overview and about how the programs can help in that, and how this could be linked to European level documents and movements and developments that are happening in the field of youth work in Europe. So to kick it off, to start, I would like to invite you to a brief Menti activity. I think by now, after a year of doing things online, most of you are probably already familiar with Menti. But in case you're not, what you'll need for the Menti activity is your phones. That's the easiest. You can also use your computers, open the web page in a different browser, but basically you need to switch between the screen where you'll see the scores, the results of your responses, and your own browser where you see the questions. So it's easier if you open your menti.com on your phones. And I have a few questions about youth work, the level of recognition and the state of youth work in the region, just to see what your experience is like and how much you know already, and what your perspective and impression is about youth work in the region. So we'll just have an overview, and then I'll tell you what the situation is actually like. So here I am sharing the screen. Let me just present, and you can, once you open the web page, this is the code that you need to type in, 27406567. I'll also type the code in the chat. So if you go to menti.com, you can type in the following code, 27406567, and we see that their results coming already, their responses coming already. The first question already, it allowed for everyone to, just to make sure we all understand the question in the same way. The question is youth work formally defined in the countries in the region? Formally meaning in a law, in some kind of legal document, and the options to respond on these questions are yes in all countries, yes in some countries, and straight no answer. And what we can see at the moment, interestingly, is that yes in some is leading by far. So we have 12 votes so far for the yes. In some countries, 13. We should be around 21 participants, so we can wait another minute to allow everyone to give responses. So it's interesting that most of you think that some countries have defined youth work, some not. There is one no answer. There is nobody saying yes in all countries. There is a definition for youth work. And in a few seconds, I'll actually reveal to you what the real answer is. So 15, 16, almost everyone. This is huge So the reality is, and this might surprise you actually, that there is a definition for youth work in a legal document in all the countries in the region. So all the countries have in some kind of law on young people, law on youth participation, whatever the law is called. There is a legal document that includes a definition of youth work. And that was also surprising for me as well when I did the research about this topic. So yes, nobody got the answer correct, but I understand why you would say yes in some, because that was my assumption as well. All right, let's go to the next question. The next question is, who is the main provider of youth work programs in the region? And the options are youth organizations, local municipalities, or ministries, national ministries for youth. So who provides youth work the most in the countries in the region? So this group is quite uniformed in the opinion. Huh? Most of you share the same opinion, or all of you by now you share the same opinion when it comes to this question as well. And actually this time you're correct. Youth organizations are the main, in some cases, the only providers of youth work programs in the region. Some local municipalities, some other agencies do provide youth work. You will hear later about some structures that exist, but mostly it is the youth organizations. You are correct. Your impression is right this time. Let's move to the next question. The next question is, are there youth centers, youth clubs in the region? And again, the same story. Yes, in all countries. Yes, in some countries, or no. So are there youth centers, youth clubs in the region? Okay, a bit more diversity this time, split between yes in all countries and yes in some countries. Let's see what the others will say. So a majority of you still think that there are youth centers in all the countries. And actually that's correct. If you browse a bit, if you ask around, you will find that all countries have some forms and some examples of youth centers or youth clubs. So some kind of youth work structures, whether they are run by organizations or municipalities or ministries, doesn't matter so much, but there are some kind of youth centers, youth spaces in all the countries in the region. Let's move on to the next question. And the next question is, which country or which countries have quality standards in the field of youth work? And here you can choose one, or you can choose all the named countries here on this slide. And quality standards in the sense of criteria, national level criteria for what quality youth work means in the country. So minimum quality standards that define what good youth work is. So let's see if you think any of the countries have quality standards. So most votes for now go to Serbia, followed by North Macedonia. Serbia winning, it's like Eurovision contest. Huh? 12 points for Serbia at the moment, 8 for North Macedonia. And there's still some responses coming. And I'll reveal to you the answer now. Maybe more results will come in a minute, but basically you're correct. Your knowledge or intuition led you the right way. At the moment, there are quality standards in 2 countries in the region. One is Serbia, the other one is North Macedonia. Even though these quality standards are not, basically it's a bit weird how this works, but basically in Serbia, they are quality standards that are prepared by the Serbian network of youth work providers, organizations providing youth work. This is NAPOR, and these quality standards are in a way somehow partly recognized by the state, because NAPOR is doing accreditation procedure for their member organizations on these quality standards. And this is endorsed by the ministry. However, this is only for within the network of NAPOR. and it brings this kind of internal assessment. In North Macedonia, it's similar. The quality standards are prepared by the Union for Youth Work in cooperation with the National Agency for Young People, for Youth and Sport, which is like the same level as the Ministry for Youth. But they are not endorsed at the moment, so they are just prepared and published. So these are the two countries that do have some documents that establish the quality standards in the field of youth work. So good job with the responses for this one. Let's go to, we have a few more only. Is youth work recognized as a profession in the region? What do you think? Is it recognized in all countries? Is it recognized in some or not at all? And this is a trick question, I have to warn you. Most of you think that is it's recognized as a profession in some of the countries in the region. So I said this is a trick question because there is a difference between profession and occupation or vocation. And the correct answer is that in none of the countries it is recognized as a profession on the same level that, for example, teacher or social worker or psychologist from the similar related professions to youth work would be recognized. So they are not recognized, youth workers are not recognized on the same level as those, so they are not a profession, but it is recognized in some of the countries as an occupation, and I'll let you know later which are those countries. So the correct answer is no as a profession, but yes as an occupation. Thank you all for responding to that one. Let's see if now connected to the previous question, which countries have occupational standards in the field of youth work? So basically, in other words, the question is, which countries have recognized some kind of youth workers as occupations or as a vocation? And again, you can choose multiple countries. And this is probably under the influence of the previous question where you were supposed to choose countries that Serbia and North Macedonia are winning. And the answer is correct for these two countries, but this time we have two more countries that have some kind of occupational standards in the field of youth work. And one of them is Montenegro, the other one is Bosnia. Later on in my presentation, I'll tell you more about them, but you are correct again about Serbia, North Macedonia, Bosnia, and Montenegro also have occupational standards. Thank you very much to all who responded. I'll stop sharing the screen now for a moment. I'm just seeing if there is anything in the chat. All right, thanks a lot for that, for participating in this activity. This was just to give you, to kick off the my presentation about the state of youth work. And now I will share the screen. I have a presentation where I have the main points outlined, not so much for reading, but more just to guide myself through the things that I want to say. Just let me know if you are seeing the screen. Yeah, okay, great. So as you already know, the topic for today is development of youth work and the state in the Western Balkans region. And to start with, I would like to open this topic by talking about what we actually mean when we say youth work. Youth work is a social service, is an approach in working with young people that is not defined the same everywhere. And if you Google for definitions of youth work, you will see many different definitions, starting from the one that is probably quoted the most from the Council of Europe, through all the other different stakeholders in the field of youth work. They have their own definition of what youth work is about. And what I've done for this presentation is that I analyzed the different definitions. First, I found the definitions of youth work in the region, in the different countries, and I've compared them. On this screen, and then on the next slide, also, you can see the definitions. We will not go into them We will not go into each of the definitions of youth work, but you'll get this presentation at the end. So if you're more curious, you can actually see how youth work is defined in each of the countries. But as you can see, this is just a proof on the previous activity for the Menti. This is a proof that actually all countries do have definitions of youth work that are taken from legal documents. Bosnia has even 2, but this is because of the unique reality of Bosnian government, and it has 2 youth laws, and each of them defines youth work a bit differently. So you see Albania, Bosnia, Kosovo, Montenegro, North Macedonia, and Serbia. And if you read through these definitions, you'll see that they are in some aspects similar, in some aspects they're different. Here on the next slide, I have the main similarities of what youth work means in the region. So if you read through the definitions, you'll see that one common element for most of them is that they are activity-based. So they start defining youth work starting from activity. They say youth work means activities that are being done for young people and by young people. Or it says, for example, in the case of Serbia, such youth activities organized by and for young people. In Montenegro, it says activities that are organized with youth and for youth. Kosovo would be youth activity organized. So it starts, it's activity based, which probably tells us something about how youth work is in general seen in the region. So it's seen more as projects on the level of projects, activities, different kind of actions that are being implemented with young people, versus being seen as a systematic approach to working with young people. So we are thinking more on this level of, we're doing projects, we're doing activities, and part of those activities that we are doing with young people are actually belong in the sphere of youth work. Then most of these definitions are focused on the personal and social development of young people. Or actually all, which goes along the lines of how the Council of Europe and all the relevant stakeholders would define youth work, that it's about supporting the personal development of the young people as an individual, and also their social development as members of the local community and of the wider society, and creating them into active, responsible citizens, etc., etc. So all definitions talk about both aspects of the development of the young person, the personal and the social one. Then most of the definitions mention voluntary participation, so that young people are involved in youth work activities on their own, by their own choice. It's their own decision to voluntarily participate in youth work. Most of them talk about the needs of young people and possibilities or opportunities or wants or abilities, and which leads us to say that youth work in the region is seen as needs-based. So it's seen as needing to respond to what young people want to see and want to do, and what their needs for development are, and also what the opportunities are, what their abilities are. So you see these elements of being needs-based in most of the definitions. And applying non-formal education is one of the common elements. So non-formal education is mentioned in most definitions as one of the main tools of youth work. So for example, here in Montenegro, it says that activities that are organized for youth and are based on non-formal education. Or actually, if you look more closely, you'll see that in most of them, some kind of non-formal education or experiential learning is mentioned. An outlier, I have to say, from all these definitions is the one in North Macedonia, which is more about youth working as an organized and systematic process of education support. So this one is not really activity-based, and the others are more this kind of project-based, activity-based. And what is also interesting is if you compare the definition in North Macedonia, it is similar to the definition that NAPOR has in Serbia. So not the formal official definition that exists in the Serbian law on young people, but in the Association of Youth Workers of Serbia, the one that the Association of Youth Workers of Serbia has created. So maybe, which leads me to the speculation, it might be a speculation, is that when the definitions are created by the practitioners in the field of youth work, maybe then they take this more approach of a systematic process of education, which we see in the case of North Macedonia, where the definition was actually created by the Union for Youth Work and just copied in the law. I'm not sure how the other definitions originated in the other legal documents, but so that's a speculation. But I see similarities between these two countries. So that's about what youth work is, and how it is defined. Now, just to take a brief historical overview, to take a bit of kind of chronological overview of the development of youth work in the region. And I've named this part as from pioneer movements to youth centers. Because as you can see, youth work is not new in the region. And I really believe, as somebody who has analyzed a lot and has explored this topic a lot in the last years, I believe this is important not to deny. So to embrace and to accept that some kind of youth work and some kind of youth structures and youth movements did exist before the 1990s, before the independence and before the system changed in all the countries in the region, including Albania, which was not part of Yugoslavia. It is because some kind of youth work, not in the sense of how we understand youth work nowadays, but some kind of youth work existed back then. And there are countries in Europe which have benefited from acknowledging that past and transforming the practices of youth work into what we want to see youth work like at the moment. So Estonia is an example. Estonia did not completely deny what has been done before in the communist period in USSR, but they transformed the pioneer centers into youth centers, for example, or they moved the movement into youth work, and then they invested in education to really transform the way it was done. But so basically, in our case, before the 90s, there was a pioneer movement. There were pioneer centers. There were some kind of communist socialist youth clubs. There were work actions being organized. There were volunteers. We sometimes joke here in the Balkans whether it was in that time that you were volunteer or voluntold, because in many cases you did not have the option to choose to opt for a volunteer, but you were voluntold to do something. But some kind of approach of working with young people existed. What happened when, after the countries got independent in the 90s, was that there was a strong foreign aid, a lot of foreign aid provided in most or all countries in the region. And some of us here who maybe remember the time in the 90s will recall that there was there were huge programs by, for example, UNICEF, UNDP, different UN bodies, different foreign ministries of international foreign governments, also different foundations, agencies, the World Bank. They all started implementing programs in the Balkans, and some of them focused on opening youth centers, doing youth work programs, etc. So I think this period of the 90s is strongly marked by the foreign aid provided in the region. And then this organization, I think, deserves its own place in the historical overview of the youth work development in the region. What used to be PRONI and then moved to Forum SIT, and then in 2007 got localized in all the countries in the region, except for Albania, I think, was a program for youth work and program for education of youth workers. And it also included opening youth clubs, which was done in partnership with the University of Jönköping from Sweden. So it was a huge program that educated, that provided non-degree, but still university course for youth workers from Montenegro, Bosnia, North Macedonia, Serbia. And I think these were the countries that were involved. Croatia was also involved. And this is how many of the youth workers in the region started. This is how the youth work programs of many organizations were influenced. So for example, this is how I started. I took part in the one-year university course of youth work in beginning of the 2000s. And what happened in 2007 was that this Forum SIT program, it ended as an international program, but then local branches actually registered as local organizations, and some of them kept working. And for example, in Bosnia, there is still very strong PRONI movement, and I'll tell you later a bit more about that. And I see more people commenting, saying me too. And yes, there was a also okay. So in Albania there was also a degree. I did not know that there was a program in Albania as well. Great. So that was Forum SIT era. The reign of Forum SIT and PRONI, which lasted for probably more than 10 years. And then what we saw in the mid-2000s was that the youth program got open for the countries from the region. And then the Youth in Action program remained open, and there was a lot of funding, and the programs were really accessible. And then if you now open if you check the biographies of organizations, youth organizations from the region, you'll see that many are actually registered in the period between 2005 and 2010. And it's because this is when this influx, the strong influx of funds and opportunities for international youth activities, youth mobilities, youth exchanges, trainings, actually opened for the region, and the funds were very flexible, with the intention, I suppose, I would say this is a speculation, but I think to a certain extent, with the intention that it could provide some kind of support, structural support to youth work. So this flexibility of funds, not asking to account for every euro that is spent, but basically all the programs that got open made a strong influence on the development of youth work in the region. And that lasted until Erasmus Plus, because then it got a bit more limited. And some countries got their own national agencies, such as Serbia and North Macedonia, and the funds also got more limited. So I think that era also came to not to abrupt end, but kind of the influence was not as strong afterwards. And what we see in the recent years, to the moment, to the current state, is that we see more, I think, processes in the region aimed at standardization, professionalization of youth work, establishing structures, building national networks of youth work, national network of youth participation, for example, youth councils. You see national youth councils being formed. You see local youth councils being established. You see youth centers being more standardized. You see movements for professionalization of youth work. RAICO got started during the recent years, which also provides for this support for this regional cooperation. You see more youth laws being adopted. So if you look at the dates of when the different laws on young people were adopted in the region, I think with the exception of Kosovo, in most other countries, it was in 2015, 2016, I think Montenegro, then 2019, Albania and North Macedonia, and the other countries, more or less. Kosovo, I think, has a bit more older law for young people, but you see more standardization in here. So this is a brief historical overview of what is happening since the countries in the region got independent, or in the case of Albania, moved from socialism to democracy. Let's move then to what is youth work practice like in the region. So what are the characteristics of youth work? I just wanted to say maybe one thing, because I see Costas wrote me a message that there was a question in Padlet. If you have any questions about what I am sharing, you can feel free to type the question in the chat or in Padlet, and then at the end of this input, we can have some time maybe to answer to some of the questions, or some of them will be addressed afterwards. So what is then youth work practice like, if we move away from the definition? I have here a triangle which kind of sees the development of youth work practice in these three different angles between the three different sides of the triangle, which are one of them is about the policy priorities and expectations. So if youth work is more on this side, that means that the practice of youth work is more dictated from the institutions, from policy documents, from strategies, etc. That the policy dictates how youth work looks like. Here on this end is that it comes from the needs, interests, wants of young people. And here on the left side is that it comes from the principles and values of youth work. And here I want to ask actually for your active participation to see where you think youth work practice is in the region. Who is pushing the development of youth work? If you go on top of your screen now, and you go view options, I think it is, you go under more, and then there is the option annotate. So if you click on annotate, you'll get another menu slide there where you can choose a stamp, or you can type text. I would ask you to choose a stamp, which could be an arrow or a heart, for example, and place it on somewhere on this triangle where you think that this side, this stakeholder is pushing the development of youth work practice. So let's see what the opinion is in this group. And we see some of you are already doing it. Please let me know if you can't find where it is.
Maybe I can just repeat it. In the very upper lower of your screen of Zoom, where you see you are viewing Dragan Atanasov's screen. Beside that, there is a view options. When you click on that, you will have a pop-up menu, or drop-down menu, how they call it. And then somewhere near the end, you will find the word annotate. When you click on that, you will have an options to choose different things to, let's say, add things on the screen. we would really like you to use stamp and answer Dragan's question.
Thank you very much, Marinella. So it's interesting, it's mostly the opinion is almost split equally between policy priorities and expectations and the needs and wants of young people, maybe a bit more on the side of the policy and less on the side of principles and values of youth work. And I would say, I think I agree with you. I think even though we could see on paper at least that it is about the needs and wants of young people, what we see a lot, and I don't know how to interpret all these other signs and stars and arrows that are outside from the triangle, maybe just playing around. But basically, I think even though on paper it's about the needs of young people, very often we see expectations from the policy documents. And maybe I would even say not so much even on a national level, maybe even policies coming on a European level. So for example, what the European Commission wants us to work on in the region. So what the priorities are, for example, of the Youth in Action, of the Erasmus Plus program, or the priorities of the donors, maybe of the donor community, the foundations, the agencies that invest funding. This is how I think we prioritize youth work programs. And I think the way I would interpret this very small number of stamps on the principles and values of youth work, it's not, it's not so much, I guess, youth work still so much based on the values. We don't really have so much shared understanding of what youth work is or how it should look like, or the values or the principles of the directions, because youth work has developed in so many different ways under influence of so many different actors in the region. So I leave it here, and this is maybe just a topic for discussion later on in the small groups. And I move to the next slide. Oops, that was me putting a star, sorry. Just sharing a list of main characteristics of what youth work is like and I'll just name them, and then later we can talk more about them. So as you already said, youth work is youth organizations are the most important, in some cases, the sole providers of youth work in the region. Then youth centers, youth clubs are, on the other hand, the main youth work structures and services that exist. They can be different, diverse, as I said, most are run by youth organizations, financially supported by donors, and some are run by municipalities. If you talk about the main thematic areas, we can highlight youth information, youth participation, volunteering opportunities locally or internationally, international mobility, youth exchanges, regional cooperation through the RICO now, intercultural learning goes along. Reconciliation was huge in the past, now a bit coming back also with RICO. Then employability became a huge topic, maybe with the Youth in Action program, which had employability as one of the priorities. And recently there is prevention of violent radicalization as a topic that is emerging in some of the countries at least. Maybe a bit undercover, it's not so visible, but it is there. And probably there are other thematic areas, but this is kind of just an overview. Something else that is important is that the funding that is available for youth work is mostly limited, mostly project-based when it is public. Also, when it comes from donors, from private foundations, it is also most project-based. So what is lacking is sustainability. What is lacking is structural funding. And what can be seen as characteristic is the dependence of foreign support, foreign aid. Then there is lack of standardization, so lack of quality criteria and lack of political and social recognition in the field. And we see this in all the countries in the region, that youth work is not enough recognized by the institutions, by the individuals, by the wider community, etc. And youth work not yet established as a profession. And then, as I said, there are no national systems for ensuring quality in youth work. As I said, Serbia is maybe the furthest in this respect, that there is some kind of national system for accreditation of youth work programs. Let me move to the next slide with some more characteristics. Youth workers are usually not defined in legal documents. In some cases, they are defined. There is definition of what youth workers are, but usually this is not the case. Now I talked about the occupational standards, and the difference between occupation and profession. There was such a question in Padlet, is that profession is basically, in simple words to understand, it is the level of education that is needed and the scope of work, the scope of competencies that somebody who is a professional youth worker or a vocational youth worker would be able to do. So profession exists if you acquire higher education in formal education. So if you have a university degree, then you can have it as a profession. If you can acquire the competencies through other types of education, then it's an occupational standard, then it's a vocation. And the vocation is on the level of usually, manual workers or different, for example, hairdressers would have an occupation, because you don't need a university degree for that. So what we see currently in the region is that there are occupational standards for youth workers in Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia and Herzegovina, and North Macedonia. And as you can see, in some cases, or in most cases, they're not even named as youth workers. So it's called youth activist in Montenegro, or associate expert on youth work in Bosnia. And then the next step after having it as an occupational standard is to have it to provide formal education for the particular occupational standard. And there are not such formal education programs existing in most countries. There are two exceptions. There is a formal program recognized by the state for youth activists in Montenegro. I think it's run by Forum MNU for Montenegro. And then there is adult educational program for youth workers, for workers with youth in North Macedonia, which is also recognized by the ministry. And they are both of them, they take the shape of few months of non-formal training run by NGOs that are registered, verified by the state, and the government provides the certificates for the ones who go through the training program. And unfortunately, in Serbia, the program is still not accredited. So that's something that needs to be done. And in Bosnia, again, it's not accredited yet, but KULT, which is one of the organizations most active in this field in Bosnia, is running, I think, for 9 years already, this kind of training program. It's based on the standard of associate expert, but it's still not accredited by the state. So the lack of formal education exists. And then some of you were talking about it in the chat. There have been trials for establishing youth work degree programs in all the countries, most of the countries in the region. So Bosnia, Serbia, Montenegro, North Macedonia. In most cases, they existed for a year or two, and then they stopped because there was a low level of interest. In Montenegro, it was never actually accredited. Somebody mentioned in the chat that it also existed in Albania, but they were all unsuccessful because they did not last. And I think my opinion, based on everything I've read and seen, is that because all of these other aspects were not taken care of. So you would open, for example, somebody would open a university degree program, but then youth work would not be established as a profession, and you wouldn't have jobs for youth workers. You wouldn't have guaranteed spaces for youth work. So you are creating educated youth workers, but then the framework around is missing. And then something else that is missing is validation of previously gained competence. I think this was mentioned, somebody somewhere mentioned, is that you could, in some case, validate the previously acquired knowledge and experience, but this requires a national system so that this validation is recognized by the state, and that still doesn't exist in any of the countries in the region. So basically, the idea is that if you are a practitioner, youth worker, working with young people for the last 10 years, for example, you've done trainings with Salto, you've done different, maybe council, you've participated in the Council of Europe trainings, etc., that you would have an option to get yourself tested in a way and validated, and then get the degree get the recognition of being a youth worker. So this is another brief exercise that I have for all of you. If you can annotate again and place the stamps of where you see the development of youth work training being. So who is pushing for development of youth work training and education in the region? Is it the government? Is it the youth work sector? Or is it education and training providers such as universities, for example? And we see most of you saying the youth work sector is pushing for training and education. And that's mostly true, because most of the training educational programs, there was a question about this in Menti that I did not include because we didn't have much time, but basically most of the programs, educational programs for youth workers, are initiated by the youth work sector. Youth organizations themselves developing their programs, hoping that they would be at one point recognized, accredited by the state. And in some cases, it is done in partnership with educational and training providers, such as universities, such as the University of Jönköping, as we saw in the example from before. Government, really, yes, you're right. It's not really interested in any of the countries for providing education for youth workers. Which, for example, if I compare with the case in Estonia, it was the Ministry of Youth that gathered the universities in the beginning of the 90s and said, "Hey, we need a youth work program. Somebody needs to start this." We don't see that happening in the Balkans. So it mostly comes from the youth work sector. Thanks for the drawings. And now I would go to the next slide, which is about some good models and practices. What we can say is a good practice, and I'm aware of time. I have like maybe 5 more minutes, right, Marinella? Something like that. Okay. So just to share some good practices. One thing that we can outline is networking, the power of networking on a national level. And what we see is that the biggest movement and the most successes come in the countries where we have some kind of national network that pushes for youth work development. In Serbia, that's NAPOR. In North Macedonia is the Union for Youth Work, which take the responsibility on behalf of 20, 50, 60 organizations in the case of NAPOR to lobby for recognition of youth work, to lobby for establishing occupational standards, to lobby for quality criteria, to lobby for education for youth workers, etc., on behalf of all of them in front of the institution. So we see that this brings positive results. In the case where you don't have such networks as in these 2 countries, it's the national youth councils taking the responsibility to lobby also for the youth work. Another example of a good practice is regional cooperation. For example, CYN being the only or the biggest Southeastern European youth network of organizations from the region, was able in the recent years to push for initiatives that push the practice of youth work into innovation. DG Youth or the Learning House that were started that promote e-learning in youth field would not be possible if you don't have that kind of regional cooperation, bringing all the practitioners and all the experts together, and because the capacities otherwise of the individual players are probably too small. Then another good practice is cross-sectorial collaboration. Local organizations with academic institutions, and in the case of the 4 programs, university programs that were started in all the countries in the region, this is how it came about. Organizations partnering with universities in the countries and with the University of Jönköping to start experimental programs, or organizations and national governments. Other good practice is that youth work policy development would be a starting point. And we see this in Serbia and North Macedonia, mostly starting with policy documents, starting with occupational standards, starting with quality standards, starting with a national portfolio of who a youth worker is, starting as in Serbia, for example, with 3 standards for youth workers, and explaining there the competences that youth workers have. You can base all your development if you have the legal grounds. And this is something that we often forget. So this is something I would really recommend, working on the policy level, regardless of how boring it might look like. Then we talked about the occupational standard. It seems to be a good entrance in the system, because starting a youth work, building it as a new profession from scratch, from zero, is difficult. And it's difficult to penetrate the system, to express myself in these words, as directly as a profession. Starting with a qualification, it seems the systems in the region are more open to introducing it as an occupation first, then developing formal education programs responding to that occupational standard, and then building on that qualification, university degree, and then profession. So starting with the small battles that you can win. And then referring to international policy documents. Council of Europe has the recommendation of youth work, European Youth Work Agenda, which was kicked off at the European Youth Work Convention last year in December, which all give recommendation to the European governments on how they should develop youth work in the region. And you can always go to your governments and go to policymakers in the region and say, we need to respect these instruments, we need to respect these recommendations or strategies if we want to follow the European development. So that would be another good model. I want to share also very briefly a few examples. You see here on the list capacity building projects in the youth field implemented through the Erasmus Plus program. Some of you will recognize by the names because I see from the names of your organizations that you were involved in implementing these projects. But basically, the Erasmus Plus program, and you'll hear more from Sonia later on probably about this, the Erasmus Plus program provides the opportunity to work on youth work development in the region. And this, I just did a very brief search through the project from the project database of the Erasmus Plus program, and these are all capacity building projects implemented by organizations from the region that were aimed at either youth work recognition or capacity building of youth workers, or development of youth work, or innovative approaches in youth work, or youth work recognition, etc. So there has been some structural work done through the Erasmus Plus program with the capacity building projects in the last 7 years. Some other practices that I want to mention very, very briefly. Youth Clubs Proni, which has, I think, 42 youth clubs through the country of Bosnia. You can see here on the map all the youth clubs that exist in Bosnia. This is a good model of cooperation between local organizations and the municipalities, supported by what used to be the Jönköping program. Then I've mentioned already Digi Youth Portal and also the Learning House established by the CYN. You can Google it, you can check what it is about. Permaculture, natural building programs among the other programs offered by the Gaia in Kosovo in few communities. So this is mostly linked quite a lot with the priorities of the new program: environmental protection, green youth work, etc. There is a mobile youth club by the Center for Youth Work, Center za omladinski rad from Serbia, which is basically a youth club that is taken through rural communities. Instead of one fixed location, is the organization going visiting rural municipalities, visiting marginalized young people, and moving the youth club from one place to another. So there are practices that we can learn from that are innovative. These are just some examples. And then the very last bit, I wouldn't go into details because also Sonia will talk about this in her part, and I've run out of my time, but I want to say, use the European policy documents. I mentioned the Council of Europe recommendation on youth work. You can see that a lot of the measures there are basically exactly in the areas in which we need development of youth work in the region. And you can always refer to them when you're writing project to your government, when you are pushing for legislation, when you are promoting youth work in the region, etc. And also the European Youth Work Convention Declaration. If you read through the measures, if you download it as a document, you will see that it's basically almost exactly what we need. And you can always say, hey, if you want to get in the EU, if you want to get integrated, if you want to be following the trends on a European level, we need to follow the measures that are recommended by the Commission and by the Council of Europe, because this was done in partnership, by the Youth Partnership. So we can always refer to them. And a good practice would be to also translate this document in a local language. NAPOR has already done that. It exists in Serbian. Translate the declaration. It's, I think, 7-8 pages, and then share it with the stakeholders. Send it to the ministry so that they also know what this document is about. Here you see the sources that I've used for this presentation. Some documents, some interviews with key informants from each country, models are borrowed from another document. I'll stop sharing, and then I'll just very briefly summarize, if I am to say, about the challenges, the common challenges that exist in the youth work, and something that we all should work on in the region, on a regional level. I would say financial, structural sustainability for youth work, for youth organizations. Greater political and social recognition of youth work in the documents, but also in reality by the institution. Standardization of quality of youth work. So knowing what youth work is, making sure that we all follow the minimum standards regardless of the different directions. Then establishing youth workers as professionals, either through the standard of occupation or in another way, but basically treating youth work as a profession. So youth workers can be employed and get salaries and be recognized by the system. And then also cooperation with institutions, cooperation with other stakeholders, and identification, keep the identification of youth work and distinguish it from youth participation. There is a lot of mixture nowadays between youth councils and youth work and youth participation and youth activism and volunteering. All of that is related, but it's not the same. So just to make sure that we don't lose the identity of youth work in all the processes for youth participation and national youth councils and activism, etc. So that was it, a lot of talking. Sorry if I ran a bit over time, but it's a huge topic and many countries to talk about.
It is a huge topic. And thank you very much, Dragan, for this great overview of the reality in youth work development from, I guess, which we can then further think and plan and build further on our work and in this same topic as organization, as a part of a puzzle, yeah, a bigger puzzle of the region. We would like to also give you a few minutes if you would like to discuss, maybe to open a time for discussion, ask a question to Dragan. We do have one question which we answered already, yeah, in the Padlet, but feel free also to just pose a question directly to Dragan here while he's with us still. We would really, really like to give you this chance. If not, of course, there's always a Padlet. If you think of something, if you need some bit more time to digest, please add it to the Padlet and we will ask Dragan to answer it further today. What are your impressions of this? Is it something that you already knew in a way, or there are many new information for you?
Maybe as we are waiting, and if there are no other questions, and if we have a minute or two to spare, I would just maybe, again, as you are thinking of the questions, I would say really the opportunity is there, and the programs, and Sonia will tell us a bit more about the opportunities later offered by the programs, but it is about using the programs in a smart way, and referring to them and referring to the documents to push things to happen. And it requires really collaboration with institutions. So if you want to develop youth work on a structural level, I think, in North Macedonia, we developed all the standards with financial support from the Erasmus Plus program. So the National Youth Work Portfolio was an Erasmus Plus grant. The National Standards for Quality in Youth Work was an Erasmus Plus grant. The process of starting a formal education program was also initiated with an Erasmus Plus strategic partnership project. So I know more opportunities are open for North Macedonia and Serbia than for the other countries, but still, even as partners in many of the projects, you can still benefit and you can still bring the topics on the agenda. And so that would be the single piece of advice I would give in relation to the programs, and then really the power of national networking, because if you approach as a group of 20 organizations that want to see youth work having higher quality, nobody would really say no, I think, from the institutions.
We have a question from Jehona.
Dragan, thank you, as always, very informative. Thinking about not just Kosovo, but all the other partner countries, I'm wondering, because there's just so much to be done, and where do you start? So I'm wondering, wouldn't potentially a good start be to become a program country instead of a partner country, because it opens a whole menu of other things that are really, really difficult to access right now. And if that's the case, how does that happen? Like, who is it a question of the member of our countries paying a fee to become a program country? Who do we need to convince?
This might even be a better question for Sonia, maybe. Sonia, do you mind tackling this?
No, I don't mind tackling this. Even though maybe you need to also start somewhere else and not just to look at the programs potentially. And in that sense, I would give the question back to Dragan. But in terms of joining the programs, well, Kosovo is a little bit specific. I mean, there I'm not completely sure to what extent now you need to solve the situation also with Serbia, really to be able to move forward. But in principle, it's every country of the region has the possibility to join the program. And it's most of all up to your ministry to put forward a request, an official request, and to express interest to join. And then, yes, it's a question of money. There's a question of contributing to the program. But it's also a question of fulfilling certain standards and criteria. So that the country needs to set up a national agency, and this national agency has to be able to manage the program in a transparent way according to different criteria. And this also means that there is a process that will run, that will look into how that happens and if that is possible. So you have to count on a preparatory process also that leads up to that. But it's based, first of all, on the interest of your ministry. Yes. And you enter the program in a package. I mean, so that's the other thing. Yeah. I mean, so it's clear that usually it assumes an interest in education, first of all. Most countries are interested, first of all, to join Erasmus Plus because of the possibilities in education. And then youth comes as part of the package. And the Solidarity Corps is a different program. And it becomes complicated potentially in the case where different ministries are responsible for different parts of the program. For example, youth and education.
We hope
I can say where we started very briefly, because this is an experience I can share. In North Macedonia, we are not, we haven't accomplished everything. There is a long way. But we started in 2013 when we formed the national network of youth workers or organizations providing youth work. And then it took really many years to consolidate ourselves and to decide what the priorities are and to see what is missing and where to start. Because you are right, Jokona, there are many different things you have to do at once. And then what we did, what helped us really to structure our effort was an IPA. I think all the countries in the region have IPA program, these pre-accession funds. We did a big IPA project, which included NAPOR as one of the key partners and CYN as another one. So we partnered with NAPOR, which was way ahead of us for a few years already working. And we partnered with CYN as a regional youth network. And we actually did a study visit in NAPOR, and we learned a lot from the Serbian experience. And this is what helped us for 2 years to establish at least the pathway. And so it was learning from how things were done, because if you compare the legislation in the countries in the region, it's very similar. And if you compare the challenges and the obstacles in the system, they're also very similar. So kind of Serbia opened, I think, the way for most of us, and we can then keep following. And that's how we started, just learning and following their path.
So before we become a program country, there are other ways to also work on youth work development on a very structural and very like high level approach. Thank you very much, Johanna, for the question and for starting this discussion. It is a very important one.